Hi everyone, my name is Grace, and today I will be presenting on Thomas Merton and Robert Lax for Module 11. I'm going to be starting with Thomas Merton. We had two readings from him, Art and Spirituality and Message to Poets. And although we've already looked at Merton, it is interesting to get a different perspective on how he views poetry and ordinary things in our daily lives. In Art and Spirituality, Merton looks at the value and the beauty in ordinary things, which tends to be neglected in the beginnings of our interior life, and our human response to reality. Over time, we can be withdrawn from God's simple creations as we are constantly bombarded with daily stimulation through all of our senses. So he talks about how we can reteach and relearn how to see, feel, taste, and experience the world, and how we can properly use our senses in order to renounce things like gin, TV, cigarettes are some of the examples that he gives, and learning how to use the things that we're given properly. He also writes about how seeing our pleasures in life as more than just those things can help us to renounce them, becoming more ascetic, and then eventually being able to use them properly and view them for what they really are, which is add-ons to our life that God has given us, which we shouldn't need any more from. Merton also digs into the idea that you can gain an aesthetic experience from the creation or contemplation of art. He says that this can create a psychological conscience that can attain the highest level of fulfillment. Art has been judged by the church in the past because there isn't a great distinction between art and entertainment. But when using art in the life of prayer, you can get flashes of aesthetic intuition, and you can gain the ability to find yourself and lose yourself all at the same time, which is something that you can't get from other platforms and that Merton stresses is very important to partake in. One of the main takeaways from this section of the reading was that art and prayer are not meant to be enemies, but when art is used correctly in the life of prayer and worship, church and art can work together to create an aesthetic experience or flashes of aesthetic intuition that people could gain a lot from. In the next section of readings, Message to Poets, Merton discusses the reason for a poem, and he says that it is not discovered until the entire poem exists itself. I thought that this was a really interesting statement that I had never really thought of before, and one of the quotes he has in the writing is, "The reason for a living act is realized only in the act itself. The reason for the fire cannot be apparent to one who is not warmed by it." By these two quotes, I kind of took from them that people can't gain anything from an experience that they're not willing to try or willing to give themselves, which I think heavily relates to the solidarity of poets, which is what he goes on to talk about, and kind of immersion into a group, a community of people. So he says that the solidarity of poets is not planned, and if it were to be, it would be prejudiced and have a cunning nature. And I think that he is making a great point here in terms of how communities form, how it's more by chance than by choice, which is a really good segue into the next section, which is poets. Merton talks about how a poet is not a cunning man, and a poet's art depends on ingrained innocence, which he would lose in business, politics, or in a too organized form of academic life. He says that all innocence is a matter of belief. It's all rooted in the fidelity to life rather than artificial systems. And it's based on interior personal convictions. And on page 156 of the reading, he says that it is in the spirit. By in the spirit, I think Merton means that because it's based on interior personal convictions, and a poet is somebody who can't thrive in an organized form of academic life, poetry is something that just calls certain people and that people step into, and in the spirit is where their poems are made, which exist only after the poem is made itself. Here again, we see the talk of the solidarity of poets. Merton brings up that the solidarity of poets is an elemental fact, such as the sun, rain, and seasons. It can't be organized, it will just happen. And like I had said before, it's a matter of chance, not choice, which I think is something that Merton strongly believes in as well. He says that true solidarity is destroyed by the political art of pitting one man against another. And on page 158, Merton says, "We must not allow ourselves to be pitted against one another in mystical comparisons, political, literary, or cultural orthodoxies." This statement begs the question, how? How are we supposed to not allow ourselves to be pitted against one another when the system of our lives compares human to human? How are we supposed to keep ourselves separated from each other and stay focused on our own work, knowing that what we do is good enough for ourselves and what other people do is good enough for them? In the second section of Module 11, we look at Robert Lax. Robert Lax was born in November of 1915 and was educated at Columbia University. He's an American poet who was very well known for his association with Thomas Merton, and he talks about poets, poetry, and a poetic life. The first reading that we look at from Robert Lax is called The Contemplative Words of Robert Lax. In the very beginning, he says that sometimes we go on a search and we do not know what we are looking for until we come again to our beginning. He talks about how compasses trace our beginnings and endings in the beginning of time. And in the beginning and end were one. They were in union, and everything moved in circles to meet at one continuous end. He also says that the part must be studied as part of the whole. The whole must be studied as being made of parts. By this, I kind of understood that to recognize a system as a whole, you have to study the individual parts. But if each individual part hasn't been studied and isn't working properly, then the whole picture, the whole system, won't work to the fullest degree. It's mainly about recognizing that although you can delve into parts of things, that you should back up frequently, assessing the big picture, assessing the whole. Lax gives a great example about what he's talking about when he means assessing the whole. He says God, the Holy Spirit, is in and out of us. He is the seed inside growing in us, and he is the outside environment that nurtures the seed and helps it grow. Here he's saying that not only is God inside, but when we back up and view the whole picture, he's also outside, protecting us and guiding us down the right path, while also giving us the tools to follow the path that he leads us on. The next major topic that Lax discusses is the nothing, which reminded me a lot of keeping silence and the idea of the not. Lax says, trace our movements, trace our thoughts, our desires too, down to the nothing from which they arise. He says that nothing is alive, nothing is holy, and nothing is to be reverenced. The nothing is described by Lax as God being everything that we need God to be for us and what we desire. He also says that words, you needn't bombard yourself with them, even in prayer. The ones you need will come up of their own accord. This quote mirrors keeping silence very strongly, in my opinion, and the idea that you should find one word and keep it centered in your mind while praying. Lax's idea of the nothing also relates back to Merton, when Merton talks about withdrawing from God's creation and how, as humans now, we're constantly bombarded and stimulated from the outside world, all of our senses, and we just need to take a step back focusing on the big picture and keeping certain words centered in our mind and not focusing on material goods and things of that nature. Next, we move on to Robert Lax's poems. And while they were written in a little bit of a confusing style, once you dig into them, they're very easy to understand and actually produce a great message. So in one of the poems, he was talking about a garden, and he mentioned that people treating problems like a garden and allowing a loving energy to flow through them will cause the garden to bloom. A solution will arise. He says that turning the jungle into a garden without destroying a single flower. And what I took from that was the goal is to declutter your mind without excising these good thoughts and intentions of prayer and devotion to God. In other words, the flower in the imaginary jungle, if you will. In the final section on Robert Lax, we have sections of a documentary called Why Should I Buy a Bed When All I Want Is Sleep, made in 1999. In the first section, called One Island, although it definitely confused me a lot, I had to watch it a couple times. What I got from it was that Earth is a circle and everything we experience in our human existence is a circle. The circle of life, circle of brown, circle of blue, circle of sea, circle of earth, and that the coming of light and dark also moves in a circle, so that what we could take from that is that there is a circle of life, and the way things move is in a circular motion from birth to death, night to day, sea to sky to ground, and all the other tactile experiences that we gain from our human existence on Earth. Like Merton, Lax also talks about appreciating the ordinary things in our lives, the simplicity of color and the complex organization of Earth. And he also says that the way to get where you're supposed to be is to get with the present moment, which is another aspect that relates back to the theory of everything moving in a circle and constantly flowing energies through one another. In the other sections of the film that we were supposed to watch, Lax talks about how sounds come and go, but the silence remains. Unbroken silence except for occasional noise. There's always something going on that is stimulating our senses during our lives until there's nothing but dark silence. The waiting in silence is where we can find peace. He says, does the darkness move? Does the silence move? They don't, and neither do I. Out of all of the Robert Lax pieces that we have looked at, I think this section of the documentary most clearly mirrors keeping silence, which we have talked about a lot in the past, and how in silence is when one can find the most peace in their own thoughts and keeping a centering word to bring them back to just complete mental quietness. And if you really look at it, our lives are also moving in a circle because, once again, keeping silence comes up as it did in the beginning of the semester, creating almost a full circle of people who believe and talk about the exact same things, meaning that they must be true. I've come up with 3 discussion questions, 2 of which you can answer in the comment section. 1, as lay people, how can we not, quote, allow ourselves to be pitted against one another in mystical comparisons, as Merton says, and remain united in art and our daily lives? 2, how can we achieve the nothing that Lax describes, and does it relate to anything that we have talked about in the past? And 3, Robert Lax focuses on the idea that everything in our existence runs in a circle. Life, death, light, dark. Do you think that there's a relation to this circle of our existence and the idea of reincarnation that is found in other religions such as Hinduism?